Bolt Action 3rd Edition has been in our hands for over a year and a half now, and Warlord has kept their promise by releasing a new plastic kit with each Armies of book that is published. These boxes, along with the other brand new kits that launched the edition, finally give me enough sprues to kitbash. So how does Warlord's new propensity for chunkiness translate when converting? Well, let's find out as we dive into Kitbash Every Sprue, Part 4. Hey, what's up everybody? We are back for the 4th go-around of Kitbash Every Sprue. Since we've been through this a handful of times already, I'm just going to throw up my self-imposed rules on the screen now. My previous videos in the series go over these a bit more if you're curious. That way, I'll have more time at the end of the video to talk about what I came up with. And also, I'd kinda just like to jump right into the kit bashing. So, without further ado, let's get to these new Bolt Action 3rd Edition plastics. The last time I took on a plastic US paratrooper kit, I improved upon what it offered as well as reassigned it to D-Day rather than Operation Market Garden. Soon after I completed that kit bash, Warlord released its own version. Yeah, this was the start of a trend, wasn't it? So now, I guess I could do the reverse, removing all the D-Day specific components and making it suitable for Market Garden. Or maybe make it worse? Or stay with the D-Day theme. I decided that these D-Day paratroopers could use a good radio man, so I got to work. To build a radio, I pulled out this styrene I-beam that is 4mm tall and 6mm wide. It is the perfect approximation for an American radio, so I cut it down to about 8mm in length. Before gluing it to the model, I first used my knife and a file to flatten the back somewhat to make for a better contact surface. Then I fixed the I-beam into place. I wanted the antenna to be scale appropriate, but also be able to stand up to abuse, and a clothing tag turned out to be exactly what I needed. This was cut down and superglued into the corner of the I-beam. Once that dried, I could begin filling in the empty spaces with green stuff. I started on the side that was pressed up against the miniature's back, then moved to the front. I used the dimensions of the I-beam as a guide to square off the putty as best as I could. Before that putty cured, I used an old hobby knife to score some detail and give the radio a little bit of definition. The nice thing about this process is that if you're not stoked on the results, you can just smooth it over and try again. The last bit the radio needed was some straps. These were made by rolling out green stuff into a very thin sheet, letting it fully cure, then trimming some slivers away to use as the straps. These were slowly superglued into place while I did my best to make them hug the paratrooper's body in a way that made sense. Two more quick modifications were needed. First, to fulfill my own self-inflicted rules, I grabbed these Garand carrying arms from the Winter American sprue. The stitched-on elbow guards were missing, of course, so I fashioned some from green stuff. And second, when I think of D-Day paratrooper radio men, I think of the character Leggett from the Brothers in Arms video games. The D-Day sprue has a head with glasses, but as is, you either have to paint the glasses dark, or you risk the googly eye effect if you want pupils. To try to remedy this issue, I used a tiny drill bit to carefully remove some of the plastic in the glasses, so that when I paint the eyes, they will appear to be behind the glasses and not on top of them. Now that my kitbash can see properly, we can finally see the finished paratrooper. I really like the Winter Fallschirmjäger kit. It has tons of character. It also has something that no other kit has, and that would be these fancy quilted pants. But what to do with these fancy pants? Well, I did what I often do. I turned to the minor nations. Hungary had a quilted parka with a similar diamond pattern that was worn by the Hanved, and Warlord has metal models to represent these, but nothing in plastic. To remedy this, I began by scraping and filing away a bit of the volume on the Fallschirmjäger parka, as I would be adding a green stuff layer, and I didn't want the jacket to look too puffy. Once the model was prepared, I started with the lower bit of the parka. Working in sections is tedious, but it ensures that you don't accidentally get your fingerprints all over your previously completed sculpting while handling the model. Once the green stuff was applied and smoothened out, I could begin on the pattern. With the fancy pants as my guide, I used my old hobby knife to make parallel lines all across the putty. Then I did the same with perpendicular lines to get that diamond texture. At first I was intimidated by this, but it's actually way easier than it looks, and if you mess up, you can smooth the putty out and just try again. I repeated this process on the rest of the torso, again, working in small sections to make sure I didn't ruin anything. While the back section was still uncured, I used my rubber sculpting tool to add a little depression where a strap would sit. For the arms, I used a Soviet carbine. This could represent either a Hungarian carbine or a captured weapon this soldier just happened to pick up. I added the quilted pattern to the left arm, then glued it into place on the torso. Now, while I said the pattern wasn't actually difficult to reproduce, the arms were a little trickier with the bend around the elbow. I followed the same steps of removing plastic, adding a layer of putty, then doing my best to make the diamonds look like they were following the lines of the arm. It took a few tries, but I finally got it into a reasonable state. Using the same method I did on the paratrooper earlier, I superglued a strap into place so that the bread bag would not just be floating on his hip. Finally, I could add a winter German head. With a tiny green stuff mustache I smudged on the upper lip, and this Hungarian finally has a fancy coat to match his fancy pants. Continuing on with the winter theme, we come to the winter British sprue. The models have a leather jerkin molded onto them that would be tough to repurpose, but I was saved when I stumbled across this photo of Canadian infantry in big winter white overcoats. As with most conversions, we apply addition by subtraction. I remove the collar and the split in the two halves of the jerkin with my hobby knife, which I then smoothed over with sprue goo to make it look like a single piece overcoat. I then glued on a head from the sprue, though to be honest I don't know why I did it at this point. Anyways, I next extended the cuffs of the pants to cover the gaiters with green stuff, doing my best to blend the putty smoothly into the plastic. With my remaining putty, I covered the split at the hem of the jerkin and then sculpted some folds, again to create a one-piece overcoat look. Next, I could turn to the head and recreate the hood of the jacket. I rolled out some very thin strips of green stuff and haphazardly applied it around the noggin. Then I removed any excess and unnecessary putty while simultaneously shaping the hood. The nice part about this is that the helmet is going to cover most of it up, so it doesn't have to be perfect. To complete the build, I attached a pointing arm from the British Airborne sprue with a tiny bit of added green stuff around the cuff to match the overcoat. Now, I was having a HE double hockey sticks of a time trying to find the correct version of a Sten gun to equip this Canuck with, and to be honest, I nearly gave up. But as fate would have it, I was rummaging over the Winter Fallschirmjäger sprue and I totally forgot there was a Sten gun arm on there. With great joy, I attached it to the model, and this Canadian is ready for the chilly weather in Northern Europe. While I personally hold the older Soviet plastic kits in high regard, I know many wargamers were waiting for the updated release, so they wouldn't have to fidget with separate arms and weapons. I bounced around a couple different ideas for converting these models, like Soviet Navy, engineers, or partisans, but a more useful project in my mind would be to turn these into Cossacks, since the unit is often used by players, but no models exist for them in Warlord's lineup. My first step was to lock down a good head for recreating the iconic fur hat worn by Cossacks. This dome from the Winter German sprue was a great starting point, but I improved upon it by scraping away the German emblem on the front, then removing the top of the cap with my clippers. Sculpting was next, and to make it easier to hold without getting my fat fingers into the putty, I glued the head under the model. My next step was to fill in the fur hat shape. I began by rolling green stuff into a small worm and wrapped it around the top of the hat. This would give the cap a bit more height to better match the real deal. Then I added more putty into the gaps created by the ear flaps of the original German hat, as well as a bit under the front where I shaved the emblem so that a circular shape was achieved. Then I used the pointy end of my sculpting tool to distress the green stuff, which created the fur texture. The final step for the hat was to add a bit of sprue glue to the top to fill in the gap between the lip of the putty and the plastic and smooth it all over. If you thought the Winterfallschirmjäger were the only units with fancy pants, then you're in for a wonderful surprise. The Cossack pantaloons had a very noticeable flare in the thigh area, and I had to make sure that this was recreated. Once again turning to green stuff, I slapped a ball onto the thigh and used my sculpting tools to get the shape looking correct. Even if it is a bit exaggerated, this is worth adding, especially since the Soviet models are very heroic in styling. Once I had the flare looking good, I used my rubber sculpting tool to add some folds to the fabric. One final detail to add was a cavalry saber, and the Japanese kit has the best approximation for such a sword. I removed a piece that looked a little bit more Japanese and glued it onto the torso. I guess this dude deserved a projectile weapon as well, so I equipped him with a PPSH submachine gun, completing the build for either a Soviet or German allied Cossack. The sprues featuring big overcoats have become the toughest models for me to use as a creative springboard. If your chosen faction doesn't have a winter kit available, just bolt on the arms and heads you do have to a great coat wearing plastic model, and voila, you have winter troops. The Winter American sprue is a very nice one to be sure, so I decided to go the simple route on this one. A buddy of mine showed me some photos of an American soldier in 1945 with a big ol' M1919 machine gun on a sling, and I figured that would be a characterful place to start. The D-Day paratrooper kit has a set of arms carrying a M1919 in a similar fashion, but it has a wooden stock that I believe was issued specifically to paratroopers, so I carefully removed it with my hobby knife. Now, I originally was just going to use these arms as is, but the pose on them is a little bit wonky and stiff, so I instead decided to remove the paratrooper arms while leaving the hands holding the machine gun intact. I did the reverse on some arms from the Winter US kit, and removed any unwanted details like this slung Tommy gun. Then, I glued the hands to the arms to get a slightly more relaxed pose. The joint of the wrists is not perfect, but that was easily remedied with some green stuff. The M1919 is quite heavy, so I needed to add a carrying strap, but first I glued a head in place so the strap could wrap naturally around the neck. Said strap was created in the same way already highlighted earlier in this video. The GI in the photos I used for reference had the strap around the barrel, but when I tried that it was a bit oppressive on the model, so I chose to attach it instead to the receiver. Now I could have stopped here, but another idea I had for this sprue was to recreate one of those soldiers from the film Fury. The cloth wrapped around his helmet is apparently a wool gas mask hood, and I decided to add one to my machine gunner. You'd think that adding a haphazardly wrapped bit of wool to the helmet would be a simple task, but I actually tried and failed like 3 or 4 times. I discovered that there is a fine line when sculpting ragged fabric on models. It can either look properly haphazard, or it looks like you simply don't know what you're doing with sculpting green stuff. Eventually, I got it looking okay, and I did my best to blend the putty into the canvas wrap existing on the helmet, and my late war machine gunner was complete. Well, we all knew this day would come. 2 years of scratch building my own full glory paratroopers, and Warlord decides to release their own plastic kit. This is fantastic news for 99.9% of wargamers, but for me, I was less than enthusiastic. Since I didn't need any more Italian paratroopers, my thoughts turned to what else I could use this new sprue for. And then I saw it, the untucked pants. Untucking pants is one of my go-to moves when doing conversions. I mean, there have already been a couple examples of that in this video alone. My buddy John has already gone ahead and started sculpting camo jumpsuits onto his paratroopers, but his work gave me an idea. Well, both his work and this badass photo of some French Foreign Legionnaires marching through the North African desert. My work began with the removal of all the Italian details, that being the knife on the belt, the pockets on the shirt, and the canteen on the waist. I also shaved away a bit of plastic at the hem of the tunic to make blending with the upcoming sculpting a bit more seamless. Speaking of that sculpting, I wanted to recreate the extended legs of the garment the Legionnaires in the photo are wearing. So I placed some green stuff onto the thigh and began working at the shape. If the green stuff is mixed with more yellow putty than blue, I find it is much easier to blend into itself and the surrounding plastic. Once I felt good about the shape, I added some folds with my rubber sculpting tool. I did the same thing for the left leg, and also added a bit more putty to cover up seams from the original tunic. The Legionnaires in the photo have these straps crisscrossed on their chest, and the easiest way to recreate this was with bandoliers from the Winter American sprue. And it was right about this point that it was brought to my attention that my reference photo depicts FFL fighters in post-World War II North Africa, meaning I have violated self-imposed rule number 5. This makes me a liar, a fraud, and a conman, so for that, I truly apologize. Anyways, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more cash grab historical wargaming content. Moving on, the paratrooper boots the miniature sports just wouldn't do for the desert sands, so I removed them with my clippers and turned to Ol Reliable, the Warlord Zulu sprue. I had these feet left over from making some shirtless hunks, but to make the toes work for my Frenchmen, I had to carefully remove them from their puddle base and then clipped away the lower leg. After successfully dry fitting, I Tarantino'd these into place. While the ankle joins were solidifying, I took the single kepi wearing head that can be found on the French sprue and glued it onto the model. This allowed me to add a small green stuffed sausage around the neck, which was flattened, and then shaped to recreate the scarves the men in the photo are wearing. With the remaining putty I had mixed up, I created some sandals by adding a blob to the feet and shaping it as best I could. The sandal strap was especially finicky. I really struggle with tiny details like these, even if they are very simple. But once the footwear was taken care of, I could add some arms from the French sprue, and this desert warrior was ready for the desert. The German Veterans Kit is a pretty good springboard for a couple conversion projects. However, I've had horses on the mind since Kitbash Every Sprue Part 1, and German cavalry seemed like a good outlet for my equestrian dreams. I had a frame of Warlord Napoleonic horses on hand, but I would need to do some work to get a rider suited for the mount. Many a hobbyist has successfully created World War II cavalry by melding the upper torso of their chosen faction with the waist and legs of para-US Civil War cavalry. But the German veterans are simply way too chunky for that. Instead, I decided to simply modify the models to fit a horse. I chose this body, as the leg positions were the closest to straddling a saddle, but I still removed the right leg to reposition it. I then began a very long, and for the most part, fruitless, process of shaving, filing, and removing plastic from both the inside of the model's legs and back, and also the saddle of the horse. My initial thought was to remove enough material to allow the German to sit naturally on the horse, and then I'd reattach the right leg I removed and fill in the gaps. However, after I licked all the plastic shavings off the model in my fingers, I realized that no matter how much plastic I destroyed, reattaching the removed leg just wasn't going to look natural or line up with the waist of the soldier. So, my backup plan was to steal a right boot from another body. This one looked to be in a natural position, and glue it to the side of the saddle. Instead of reattaching the thigh, I just decided to sculpt it. I started with an armature, or ligature, I guess? Once that fully cured, I added more green stuff to bulk out the trousers, and after that was shaped to my liking, I added folds with my rubber sculpting tool. Over top of this, I resculpted the helm of the tunic, and filled any gaps I had created in my destructive phase. Speaking of rebuilding what I had destroyed, I also resculpted some baggage I had removed when trying to fit the body onto the horse. Then I glued on this arm holding the reins, which I think came from the paratroopers sprue, and then I filled in the gaps with green stuff. This was followed by gluing some random German equipment onto the saddle to add some extra detail. I also attached the head, and then realized I was missing stirrups, which I've been told are pretty important pieces of equipment for riding horses. I created these in a very similar fashion to how I make weapon straps. Fully cured green stuff sliced into strips, methodically supergluing them into the position around the foot. They are a bit oversized, but that's fine for a wargaming piece. The last step was to give this cavalryman his rifle, and this 19th century soldier stuck in a 20th century world was complete. With all the models built, there's only one thing left to do: get them painted, which left me with this. So there you have it. The first wave of Bolt Action 3rd Edition plastics have successfully passed the Rubicon that is my hobby blade. I purposefully left the intro to this video short so I'd have more time to discuss the final results, so let's briefly look them over. The Winter Fallschirmjäger kit worked pretty well for the Winter Hanved conversion. I feel like following this process would be reasonable for a squad or two. I mean, the sculpting is tedious, but it's actually quite simple, and you could add a lot of variety to your Hungarian army this way. I'm certainly not the first hobbyist to hijack the M1919 machine gun from the US D-Day Airborne kit, but splicing the weapon onto the Winter American arms was super simple and ties in better with the model. Of course, you'd probably only do this once or twice for an army, but it is a nice, easy way to model an American LMG in plastic. This Cossack conversion is also dead simple, and would make for a really great army project if you were interested. Not every Cossack needs the iconic hat, you can mix in helmets and other headgear, and the fancy pants are also a breeze to create with green stuff. You don't even really need other kits, if you want to be budget-minded. I don't think the radio build for the D-Day paratroopers is the most exciting conversion I've ever done, and since radios don't actually do anything in-game, their inclusion would be totally superfluous. It is difficult to change a kit like this one into something that it's not, as the uniform, weapons, and gear are so iconic, which means creating characters or more dynamic poses is kind of the only option. Let me know if you think drilling out the glasses was worth it. I probably could have gone a little farther with it, but was fearful of destroying the glasses entirely. but with this series I do like to try some new techniques on models that won't be a part of my existing forces. I really like how the Winter Canadian turned out, and I definitely think that this conversion would be a great candidate for creating multiple squads, or even an entire army of snowsuit donning Canucks. This is another idea that doesn't actually require other kits, unless you really want to use the correct version of the Sten gun. I'm pretty happy with how my French Foreign Legionnaire turned out, but it would take a prohibitive amount of work to get a squad or two built up using the Paracadutisti kit. If you're just using Warlord parts, it's especially difficult to source proper weapons, rifle pouches, and other items. Not to mention the French sprue only includes a single Kepi wearing head. But rumor is that Warlord will be releasing their own FFL kit with the Armies of France book, so we'll see what's included on those frames. And finally, we get to the German cavalry. You may notice that I spent a bit more time painting this kitbash compared to the others. That's because there's a really good chance I use this model as a springboard for a larger project. I'd love to do a cavalry army, especially a less obvious one, and doing it all in plastic would allow me to add a good amount of character to each miniature. So, keep an eye out for updates on that adventure. Be sure to let me know down in the comments which kitbash you liked best, or where I missed the mark. So, what's next for the Kitbash Every Sprue series? I'm not too sure, to be honest. There are more kits coming from Warlord, but many seem to fit already niche roles, and coming up with unique ideas for each sprue is getting more and more difficult. You may have noticed that I neglected the new Japanese kit, and if you did, you are most likely demanding an explanation. Honestly, the new kit is so similar to the old in size and style that there wasn't much I was excited about kitbashing it with. I did have a whole army project in mind for them, as I was hoping the new sculpts would be larger, like all of Warlord's other recent releases, but they aren't, so that ship has sailed. Of course, the kitbashing videos won't end here, so make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. It tells both YouTube and myself that these projects are worth creating. We'll see you next time.